Well, I say this: homophobia is never acceptable. Now, there might be some people who think that comments like Taylor's are all a bit of a joke, and I think that's often the case. People say things and then they say, "Oh, don't take it seriously, it's all of a joke," and if you're upset or you take offence, you're regarded as being somehow thin-skinned. Well, I think people who think that comments like that are all a bit of a joke perhaps should look first at the Ian Thorpe interview, because it isn't a joke to be on the receiving end of a word like pufter or many other words like it. It's no joke to be caught in the crossfire of prejudice, and it's no joke to live with the fear of being rejected or vilified or persecuted because of who you are. The fact is, we still hear homophobic insults and slurs bandied around as if they're acceptable, harmless, just a bit of a laugh. Well, it isn't a laugh to a young person growing up, working out who they are, surrounded by an atmosphere of hostility. They can feel alone, isolated from their peers, isolated from their community and sometimes even their family, as if people like them are so worthless they can be abused, bullied, belittled or mocked, that it's perfectly acceptable. A study released earlier this year by a team of researchers from the University of Western Sydney showed homophobia directed at young gay people remains prevalent in Australia's schools, our workplaces, on our streets and in other public venues, including sporting events. So these researchers surveyed just over 1,000 young people who identified as gay or sexuality diverse, and they found almost 2/3 had experienced some form of overt homophobia or transphobia. 64% had been verbally abused, 18% had been physically abused and 32% had experienced other forms of prejudice and hatred. Homophobia has serious consequences for its victims. The Growing Up Queer study found 41% of the young people surveyed had thought about self-harm or suicide, 33% had harmed themselves and 16% had attempted suicide. These are really sad statistics that, and a reminder of the effect of prejudice, that you can have these sorts of results of so many young people thinking about self-harm or suicide and so many attempting suicide because of how they feel. Today, a new survey on the incidence of homophobia in Australian sport has also been released. It's called Out on the Fields, and it's a study which surveyed some 2,500 athletes and players, gay and straight, at all levels of sport. And half the gay sportsmen and women responding to the survey reported that they had experienced homophobic abuse. 1 in 4 of the straight men responding to the survey had also been targets of homophobia. As the footballer Jason Ball says, to all of the people who thought that Brian Taylor's comments weren't a big deal, this research shows that homophobic language has a profound impact on our sporting culture. Slurs on the basis of someone's sexuality is not acceptable in any circumstance, let alone when broadcasting live into the living rooms around the country. People whose words are being heard by millions have an important responsibility to think of the consequences of their actions. And this isn't the first time Mr Taylor has used homophobic language on the air. I note that he has apologised for his latest remark. Well, if he can't exercise self-control and just blurts these things out in the heat of the moment, perhaps he isn't qualified to be sitting in front of a live microphone. Now, those who broadcast these thoughtless comments also have responsibilities. The Commercial Television Industry Code of Practice provides that a TV station must not broadcast material likely to provoke or perpetuate intense dislike, serious contempt or severe ridicule against people on the grounds of sexual preference. So Channel 7 was right to insist that Mr Taylor withdrew his remark and apologise on air. I'm also very pleased to acknowledge the efforts of the AFL, which has been one of the most progressive sporting codes in Australia in combating prejudice on and off the field, including prejudice on the grounds of sexuality and obviously, of course, also race. Indeed, earlier this year, the organising bodies of all 4 of Australia's major football codes, together with Cricket Australia, made a commitment to introduce new policies to stamp out homophobia. But unfortunately, it only takes one thoughtless remark to undermine these efforts. Are people in prominent positions really that ignorant, really that cruel, really that careless, or so prejudiced? Because if they are, they simply don't deserve to occupy positions where they can hurt people by what they say. I think Mr Taylor and others could learn something from a group of students I met at Unley High School in Adelaide recently, in my home state of South Australia. They saw the impact that using jibes such as "you're so gay, that's so gay" as an insult that could have an effect on people who are gay. So they formed a group at the school and launched an annual Think Before You Speak week. And they stood up and said to their peers, "Homophobia isn't on." So I'd like to acknowledge two of the key students involved in Unley High School's Gay Straight Alliance, Isaac Tilley-Swift and Ben Stremple, and the support from the coordinating teacher Jo van der Zwag and Principal Susan Cameron, because this is a real example of leadership. And it's an example Brian Taylor should take on board. Mr Taylor could also learn from the courage shown by Ian Thorpe over the weekend. Ian Thorpe spoke about the anxiety he'd suffered because of anti-gay attitudes in the community. He said, "I wanted Australia to be proud of me. I didn't know if Australia wanted its champion to be gay." I think it's terribly sad that Ian Thorpe was worried that Australians would not accept him as their sporting champion if he were gay. Terribly sad that he worried that Australians would not celebrate his extraordinary achievements as our representative if he were gay. And it is as sad that every day in Australia people are made to feel confused, conflicted or even guilty over their identity. Thoughtless comments like Brian Taylor's only contribute to an environment where people feel like this. But the courageous actions of people like Ian Thorpe and the students at Unley High School reassure me, and they demonstrate that for every unthinking, ignorant, cruel bigot in this country, there are hundreds of thoughtful, tolerant, decent and ethical people. For every loudmouth, there are hundreds of people quietly behaving with integrity and with dignity. And for every homophobe, there are hundreds of people, gay and straight, with the courage to stand up for what is right.